Medieval women's biggest fears and ways to avoid pregnancy in 1348, England. They did not call it the Black Death. That name would come later, draped in the ink of chroniclers who had never felt the buboes swell beneath their own jaws. In the autumn of 1348, as the first eerie mists began to coil through the Somerset levels, and the nights grew cold enough to still the frogs in the ditches, the women of England called it simply the pestilence, or the great mortality. Or they did not name it at all. They spoke in whispers if they spoke of it. They touched wood. They crossed themselves. They pressed dried rue into the tiny linen bags hung around their necks, and tried not to think of the ships that had crept into Melcombe Regis the previous June, carrying rats and fleas, and a horror that walked upright in the shape of a man. For the women of that benighted year, the alewives and the nuns, the midwives and the manorial ladies, the cotters' wives and the outlaws hiding in the greenwood, fear was not a single beast but a hydra. It had many heads, and each head had teeth. There was the fear of childbirth, which killed one woman in every 3 who conceived. There was the fear of rape, which was not a crime against a woman, but a trespass against her father's or husband's property, and which left the victim with a bastard child she could not feed and a reputation shredded beyond repair. There was the fear of hunger when the harvest failed, of the seigneur's droit de cuissage, that myth which was not a myth everywhere but was believed to be real in every village, of the accusation of witchcraft from a neighbor whose cow went dry, of the fistula that could rot a woman from the inside after a difficult labor, of the leper's bell, of the stake, of the rope. And then, woven through all these terrors, like a black thread through a tapestry, there was the fear of pregnancy itself. Not the romanticized quickening that poets wrote of in their dreary ballads, but the heavy, waddling, life-threatening state of being with child, in a world without antisepsis, without forceps, without cesarean sections that left the mother alive, without any understanding of germ theory, or the importance of a midwife washing her hands between patients. Pregnancy was a battlefield, and the womb was the field. Every woman knew this. Her mother had told her. Her grandmother had told her. The churching ceremony after a birth, when a woman was finally permitted to re-enter the church and be cleansed, was not merely a ritual of purification. It was a thanksgiving for having survived. Many did not. But the women of 1348 were not passive victims of their biology. Despite the church's thunderous condemnations, despite the civil laws that punished infanticide but looked the other way at abandonment, despite the complete absence of what we would recognize as formal medical education for women, they possessed a secret and largely oral tradition of fertility management. They knew herbs that could bring on a delayed monthly bleeding. They knew potions that could restore the courses. They knew mechanical barriers made of linen and wool, soaked in vinegar, or the juices of sour herbs. They knew the rhythm of the moon and the body, even if they could not have articulated the science of ovulation. They knew withdrawal. They knew prolonged lactation. They knew, in desperate whispers, of the sharpened stick and the fall down the stairs and the old woman up the lane who could turn the womb with her hands. This is the story of those fears and that knowledge. It is a story that does not appear in the manorial rolls, which record only debts and livestock and the occasional fine for lechery, It does not appear in the sermons of the bishops who thundered against unnatural acts while knowing full well that their own housekeepers brewed pennyroyal tea. It appears, if you know how to read it, in the medical compendiums written by anonymous monks who borrowed from Hippocrates and Galen and from the wise women they publicly condemned. It appears in the court records of women tried for abortion, though their crimes were often simply poverty. It appears in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, where a nun has scribbled a recipe for a draught to bring down the menses in a tiny, crabbed hand. And it appears in the bones of the women themselves, in the pelvic deformities caused by rickets from malnutrition, in the healed fractures of forearms raised to ward off a blow, in the empty graves of children who did not live long enough to be named. To understand these women, we must set aside our modern assumptions. We must imagine a world where the average life expectancy for a woman who survived childhood was perhaps 40 years, but where that average was pulled down so brutally by maternal death that a woman of 30 was considered elderly. We must imagine a world where the church taught that Eve's sin had cursed all women to bring forth children in sorrow, but where that same church also taught that any attempt to avoid that sorrow was a mortal sin equal to murder. We must imagine a world where a woman's primary value, economically, socially, theologically, was her fertility, and yet that same fertility could kill her at any moment. And we must imagine this world in the specific apocalyptic context of 1348. The pestilence was coming. It was already in the port towns. By Christmas it would be in London. By Candlemas it would be in every village in England. And for women, the approach of the plague did not erase their existing fears. It amplified them, twisted them, and added new nightmares to the list. What did it mean to be pregnant when the plague was at the gate? What did it mean to try to avoid pregnancy when every healthy womb was suddenly a precious resource for a dying population? The contradictions of that moment, the collision of personal survival and communal collapse, are the subject of this deep and sorrowful history. The first fear, the bloody bed. No fear cut deeper than the fear of childbirth. We have statistics from later periods, from 17th century England, from 18th century France, that suggest a maternal mortality rate of between 1 and 3% per birth. That number, terrifying enough. To modernize, it would mean that a woman who bore 6 children had roughly a 15% chance of dying in labor, is almost certainly an underestimate for 14th century England. The figures we have come from parish registers, which record burials, but they do not record miscarriages, stillbirths, or the deaths of unbaptized infants, who are often buried outside consecrated ground without entry in the register, nor do they record the women who died of puerperal fever a week after a seemingly successful birth, their lochia turning black and foul, their bodies burning with a fever that no amount of prayer could quench. The true rate of maternal death in medieval England was probably closer to 1 in 25 per birth, or even 1 in 20. For a woman married young and fertile from her mid-teens to her late 30s, bearing a child every 18 months to 2 years, the cumulative risk was catastrophic. Perhaps 1 woman in 3 who began her reproductive life did not finish it. She died on the birthing stool, or in the blood-soaked straw of her bed, or in the corner of the hut where she had crawled to die alone because the midwife had given up and gone to save someone else. What did that death look like? It looked like hemorrhage. The flooding that could not be stopped, no matter how many cobwebs or crushed yarrow leaves were pressed into the womb. It looked like obstructed labor, the baby too large, the pelvis too small. A common consequence of childhood rickets, which softened the pelvic bones, the head stuck, the mother pushing for 2 or 3 days until she simply had no strength left, until her urine turned to blood from the pressure, until the midwife had to choose between the mother and the child, and the church's law said, always the child, because the child could be baptized in extremis and saved, while the mother's soul was already made or unmade. It looked like the terrible complication called a fistula, where the prolonged pressure of the baby's head against the vaginal wall caused tissue to die and rot, leaving a passage between the bladder and the vagina so that the woman leaked urine for the rest of her miserable, shunned life. It looked like convulsions, eclampsia, we call it now, where a woman's blood pressure rose so high that her body began to seize, her teeth clenched, her back arched, and she died in the middle of a contraction, her baby still inside her. Every woman in England in 1348 knew these stories. They had witnessed them. They had held the hand of a dying sister, a mother, a neighbor. They had watched the priest arrive too late. They had helped the midwife wash the body and bind the jaw shut with a linen cloth. The fear of childbirth was not abstract. It was as concrete as the grave. And yet they continued to conceive. Some had no choice. Their husbands had a legal right to conjugal relations, and refusing that right could mean a beating, an accusation of witchcraft, or simply being thrown out of the house to starve. Some wanted children. Children were labor. Children were security in old age. Children were the only form of wealth a poor woman could accumulate. But many, many women wanted fewer children, or no more children, or at least a respite from the relentless cycle of pregnancy, birth, lactation, and pregnancy again. Their desire to avoid pregnancy was not a modern feminist rebellion against their biological destiny. It was a survival instinct. It was the arithmetic of the womb. Every pregnancy was a roll of the dice, and the dice were loaded: the church, the state, and the sin of Onan. To understand what medieval women knew about contraception, we must first understand what they were forbidden to know. The Catholic Church of the 14th century had a well-developed and remarkably consistent doctrine on the purpose of sex. That purpose was procreation. Any sexual act that deliberately frustrated the possibility of conception was a mortal sin. This included the sin of Onan, Genesis 38, 8-10, in which Onan spilled his seed upon the ground to avoid giving a child to his dead brother's widow. It included anal sex, oral sex, manual sex, and any form of coitus interruptus or withdrawal. It included the use of any potion, herb, or device to prevent conception or to terminate a pregnancy. And it included sex during pregnancy, during lactation, during menstruation, or during the 40 days of Lent, not because these acts necessarily prevented conception, but because they were unnatural in the sense that they prioritized pleasure over the divinely ordained purpose of the act. The penalties for contraceptive use were severe. In theory, a woman who knowingly used herbs to restore her menses, the common euphemism for inducing an abortion or bringing on a late period, could be excommunicated. Excommunication was not merely a spiritual penalty. It meant that no one could trade with you, speak to you, or bury you in consecrated ground when you died. In practice, excommunication for contraceptive use was rare because the act was private and the knowledge was secret. But it was a sword that hung over every woman's head. Confessors were trained to ask specific questions about the sin of impeding nature. The penitential manuals, or libri penitentiales, were full of detailed inquiries. Have you taken any potion to destroy what you have conceived? Have you done anything to prevent the birth of a child? Have you lain with your husband during your monthly courses? Have you used any herbs to make yourself barren? The church's position was not entirely without nuance, and that nuance created a kind of loophole that women exploited mercilessly. The theologians distinguished between contraception, preventing conception, and contragestation, terminating in early pregnancy. The distinction was fuzzy, and it revolved around the vexed question of ensoulment. Following Aristotle, many medieval theologians believed that the male fetus did not receive a soul until 40 days after conception, and the female fetus not until 80 days. Before those points, the pregnancy was not yet a human in the full sense. Some scholastics argued that interfering with a very early pregnancy was therefore a lesser sin than abortion later in pregnancy, perhaps not a sin at all, but merely a moral irregularity. This theological hair-splitting was not something the average village woman understood in its Latin intricacies, but the midwives and the cunning women understood the practical implication. If you took a potion within a few weeks of a missed period, you might be guilty of a sin, but it was probably not the mortal sin of murder. The state, for its part, was less interested in contraception than in infanticide. A woman who gave birth secretly and killed the child could be hanged. A woman who abandoned a child at the church door or the monastery gate was guilty of a crime, though a relatively minor one. The church operated foundling hospitals, and abandonment was often tacitly accepted as a desperate solution. But a woman who simply prevented a birth from occurring? The common law had almost nothing to say about that. There was no statute against contraception in 14th century England. There were no prosecutions for the possession of pennyroyal or the use of a linen pessary. The law only cared if a child was born alive and then killed. What happened before birth or before conception was largely a matter for the church courts, and the church courts were slow, overburdened, and reluctant to pry into the marital bed. This legal and theological gap between the thunder of the pulpit and the silence of the assize court was the space in which medieval women practiced their reproductive agency. They knew they were sinning. Most of them believed they would have to answer for it at the judgment. But they also believed that God was merciful, that he understood the desperation of a woman with 5 children and a 6th on the way, and a husband who had just died of the sweating sickness, that the Virgin Mary, who had conceived without sin and given birth without pain, would intercede for them. The terror of divine punishment was real, but it was often eclipsed by the more immediate and terror of the birthing bed, the herbal tradition, the old women's pharmacopoeia. The most important source of contraceptive knowledge in medieval England was not the universities of Oxford or Cambridge, which did not admit women and taught only a heavily theoretical, text-based medicine derived from Galen and Avicenna. It was the oral tradition of the wise women, the midwives, the herbalists, the cunning folk who lived on the margins of every village and knew the properties of every plant that grew in the hedge, the wood, and the fen. These women were often illiterate. They did not write down their recipes. They passed them from mother to daughter, from mistress to apprentice, in muttered Old English, and Anglo-Norman French, in songs and rhymes and little prayers that were half Christian and half something older. The herbal pharmacopoeia of medieval England was astonishingly rich. Modern research has confirmed that many of the plants used by medieval women have genuine pharmacological effects on the reproductive system. They are emmenagogues, substances that stimulate menstrual flow, and abortifacients, substances that can terminate a pregnancy. In small doses, they might bring on a late period. In larger doses, they could induce a miscarriage. In very large doses, they could kill the woman herself. The line between therapeutic and toxic was thin, and the wise women walked it every day. The most famous or infamous of these herbs was pennyroyal Mentha pulegium. Pennyroyal grew wild in damp places across England. A low-growing plant with small lilac-colored flowers and a sharp, minty smell. Its active compound, pulegon, is a potent uterine stimulant. A tea made from pennyroyal leaves, drunk strong and hot, could bring on uterine contractions. Medieval women used it to bring down the flowers, to induce menstruation when their periods were late. They knew it was dangerous. They knew that too much could cause violent vomiting, abdominal pain, liver failure, and death. They used it sparingly and with respect. Rue ruta graveolens was another common emmenagogue, though it was more often grown in gardens than found wild. Rue has a bitter, unpleasant taste. Medieval herbals describe it as hot and dry in the 3rd degree, and its active compounds, including rutin and chalapensin, can indeed stimulate uterine contractions. Rue was also used as a protective herb, hung over doorways to ward off the evil eye, and its association with the flower's menstruation was strong enough that it appears in the folk names. Herb of Grace was one, but Mother of the Herbs was another. Savin juniperus sabina was perhaps the most potent and the most feared. Savin is a type of juniper, a low-growing shrub with scale-like leaves and a pungent, resinous smell. Its active compounds, including podophyllitoxin and deoxypodophyllitoxin, are extremely toxic and can cause severe uterine bleeding, kidney failure, and death. Medieval women knew savin as the herb of death or the abortion bush. It was used only in the most desperate cases, and even the wise women were reluctant to recommend it. The 14th century English medical texts, known as the Woman's Herbal of the Antidotary, a compilation of recipes from various sources, warns that savin should be given with great caution, for it has killed many a woman who took too much. Other plants in the medieval contraceptive repertoire included Tansy tanacetum vulgar, which was also used as a culinary herb. Tansy cakes were eaten at Easter, but which in large doses is an abortifacient. Wild carrot Daucus carota, whose seeds were chewed as a contraceptive in ancient Greece and Rome, and whose use persisted in English folk medicine into the early modern period. Queen Anne's lace, another name for wild carrot, whose seeds contain compounds that interfere with progesterone. Cotton root bark, which was imported from the Mediterranean and was expensive, but which was known to have powerful effects on the uterus. And Artemisia species like mugwort and southernwood, which were used both as emmenagogues and as protective herbs against elf shot and other malign influences. The wise women did not just use single herbs, they compounded them, mixing pennyroyal with rue and honey to make a syrup, or steeping savin in wine to make a tincture, or grinding dried tansy flowers into a powder that could be added to broth. They timed the dosages to the moon because they believed correctly, as it happens, that the body's rhythms were linked to the lunar cycle, and that a potion taken at the new moon was more likely to work than one taken at the full. They knew that the best time to prevent pregnancy was immediately after a missed period, and they urged women to act before the child quickens. That is, before the mother could feel the baby move, which usually occurred around 16 to 20 weeks. After quickening, the risk to the mother increased exponentially, and the moral stakes in the eyes of the church rose as well. Mechanical means, the linen cloth, and the woolen plug. Not all contraceptive methods in medieval England were herbal. Women also used physical barriers, though the evidence for these is more fragmentary because they left no trace in the archaeological record and were rarely described in writing. The most common barrier method was the pessary, a small plug made of linen, wool, or sometimes leather, soaked in a substance that was either spermicidal or simply sticky enough to block the passage of sperm. The 12th century Jewish physician Maimonides, whose works were known in England through Latin translations, mentioned pessaries made of soft wool soaked in oil and vinegar, inserted into the vagina before coitus. English women adapted this recipe using available materials. Sheep's wool abundant in a wool exporting country, linen rags, every household had them, and a soaking solution of vinegar, which is mildly spermicidal, or the juice of sour herbs like sorrel or dock. The efficacy of such pessaries was limited. Medieval women had no understanding of the microscopic nature of sperm, and they could not know that a woolen plug, even soaked in vinegar, might leave gaps through which sperm could swim. But they were not stupid. They observed that women who used these methods sometimes did avoid pregnancy, and women who did not use them sometimes became pregnant. The correlation was enough to justify the effort, and the effort was minimal. A woman could prepare a linen pessary in a few minutes, insert it before going to bed, and remove it the next morning. If she could not afford linen or wool, she might use a sponge. Sponges were imported from the Mediterranean and were expensive, or a wad of moss, free but less reliable. Another mechanical method was the cervical cap, a device made of wax or resin that was molded to fit over the cervix. This was a more sophisticated technology, and it was probably known only to a few wise women and perhaps to some of the more educated nuns in the larger convents. The 13th century medical text De Secretis Mulierum on the Secrets of Women, which was widely circulated in manuscript, despite being attributed probably falsely to Albertus Magnus, describes a cervical cap made of gum, arabic, and wool shaped to the size of the woman's neck, inserted before the act. Gum arabic was an import from North Africa, and it would have been available only in towns and cities, but the principle was clear. Block the entrance to the womb, and no child will form. The most controversial physical method, and the one that the church condemned most fiercely, was the sterile coitus known as coitus interruptus, or withdrawal. In this method, the man withdraws his penis from the vagina before ejaculation, spilling his seed elsewhere. The church considered this the sin of Onan, and confessors were instructed to ask married men specifically about it. But many couples practiced it anyway. It required no herbs, no devices, no special knowledge. It required only that the man have enough self-control to withdraw in time, and that the woman trust him to do so. In a culture where men had absolute legal authority over their wives, that trust was often misplaced. But some husbands, out of love or out of a shared desire to limit their family size, cooperated. And some wives, more pragmatic than romantic, simply made sure to rise from the bed before their husbands finished, a maneuver that required some agility but was not impossible. Magic, charms, and superstition. For every woman who knew the correct dosage of pennyroyal, there were 10 who wore an amulet made of a weasel's testicles, dried and strung on a red thread to prevent conception. Medieval reproductive medicine was a blend of empirical observation, classical theory, and folk magic, and it is anachronistic to separate these categories as we might today. A woman who wore a piece of jet around her neck to prevent pregnancy was not being irrational in the modern sense. She was participating in a system of belief that was coherent, consistent, and widely shared. Jet, a fossilized wood, was believed to have the power to absorb evil influences, including, presumably, the influence of a man's seed. An amulet made of a wolf's tooth, worn at the waist, was thought to cool the womb and drive away lust. A ring set with a sapphire, if worn on the left hand, was said to preserve chastity and prevent conception from adulterous unions. Sapphires were expensive, of course, and only wealthy women could afford them, but the belief was widespread. Perhaps the most common magical contraceptive was the herbal charm, a piece of parchment inscribed with a prayer, a saint's name, or a magical symbol, which was then folded and worn in a small bag around the neck or tied to the thigh. The line between prayer and magic was blurry in the medieval mind. A prayer to Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of childbirth, might be used to prevent pregnancy as well as to ease it, depending on the wording. A charm that invoked the 3 magi, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, was thought to have special power over the womb, because the magi had visited the Christ child in his mother's arms and had thus witnessed the miracle of virgin birth without losing their own potency. Some charms were remarkably explicit. The Lachnunga, an Old English medical text from the 10th century, but still copied and used in the 14th, contains a charm against a swollen womb that involves reciting a prayer over a mixture of herbs and then applying it to the belly. The prayer asks God to bind the womb of this woman so that no child may grow there. This is a direct request for contraception embedded in a Christian framework. The scribe who copied the Lachnunga did not seem troubled by the theological implications. The wise women also used sympathetic magic, the principle that like affects like. If a woman wanted to prevent pregnancy, she might be advised to tie a knot in a piece of string while saying the name of her husband, then hide the string in a hollow tree. As long as the knot remained tied, the husband's seed would be tied and could not enter her womb. Or she might be told to eat a handful of raw parsley seeds. Parsley was associated with the god of the underworld, Persephone, in pre-Christian traditions, and the association lingered while walking backwards around her house 3 times. Or she might be instructed to place a cold key under her pillow, because cold metal draws the heat from the seed. It is tempting to dismiss these practices as mere superstition, irrelevant to any real understanding of medieval contraception. But that would be a mistake. The belief in the efficacy of a charm or an amulet was itself a powerful psychological tool. A woman who believed she was protected was less anxious, and lower anxiety could affect her hormonal balance in ways that might, in fact, reduce her fertility. More importantly, the practice of wearing an amulet or reciting a charm gave women a sense of agency in a world where they had very little. They could not choose their husbands, could not refuse sex, could not leave a marriage without losing their children and their livelihood. But they could knot a string. They could pick a herb. They could whisper a prayer. In those small acts, they asserted that their bodies were not entirely the property of their husbands or their priests. The lactation loophole, prolonged nursing. One of the most effective and most overlooked methods of pregnancy avoidance in medieval England was prolonged lactation. Breastfeeding suppresses ovulation in many women, a phenomenon known as lactational amenorrhea. The mechanism is hormonal. The suckling of the infant stimulates the release of prolactin, which inhibits the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, GnRH, which in turn suppresses the menstrual cycle. A woman who breastfeeds exclusively and frequently, every 3 to 4 hours day and night, is unlikely to ovulate for the first 6 months after birth, and may remain infertile for much longer if she continues to nurse. Medieval women knew this, though they did not understand the hormonal mechanism. They observed that, women who nursed their babies for 2 or 3 years often did not conceive again during that time, while women who weaned their babies early because they had to return to work, or because they gave the baby to a wet nurse, or because the baby died, often conceived again within a few months. The correlation was so strong that midwives actively advised women who wanted to space their children to keep the child at the breast for as long as he will suck, even until his 3rd year. Prolonged nursing had other benefits. It was free, unlike wet nurses who were expensive. It provided the infant with antibodies and nutrition that reduced the risk of death from the many infectious diseases of childhood. And it was entirely in keeping with church teaching. There was no sin in nursing a child, even for years. Indeed, the church encouraged it, because it kept women at home and out of trouble. The ideal of the Virgin Mary nursing the infant Jesus was a powerful cultural image. And women who breastfed their own children, rather than sending them to wet nurses, as wealthy women often did, were praised as virtuous mothers. But prolonged nursing was not a guarantee of infertility, and medieval women knew that too. Some women ovulated while nursing, especially if they were well nourished, and the famines of the early 14th century, including the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, had left many women chronically malnourished. Others ovulated as soon as the baby began sleeping through the night, reducing the frequency of suckling. Still, others conceived while nursing, and then faced the terrible choice of continuing to nurse one child while pregnant with another, a situation that drained the mother's body of nutrients and often led to a low birth weight baby, or a miscarriage, or the death of both infants in the first year. The demographic evidence from the few surviving manorial records suggests that the average birth interval in 14th century England was about 24 to 30 months, a spacing that is almost exactly what we would expect from prolonged nursing combined with a moderate degree of postpartum abstinence. The church recommended 40 days of abstinence after birth. But many couples waited longer, either out of piety or out of fear of another pregnancy. This spacing was not accidental. It was the result of intentional choices made by women, often in consultation with their husbands, to manage their fertility in a world without reliable contraception. But the approach of the pestilence changed the calculus of nursing. In the plague year of 1348, women faced a terrible new variable. If they nursed their infants for 2 or 3 years, they would be less likely to conceive again, but they would also be tethered to an infant during a time of mass death. What if the plague came to the village and the mother had to flee? What if she fell ill and could not nurse? What if her milk dried up from the fever? The old wisdom of prolonged nursing suddenly seemed inadequate to the new reality. This is not a complete history. No history of medieval women can be complete because the women themselves left so few records. They wrote no manifestos, kept no diaries, with a few remarkable exceptions, like the letters of Margaret Paston, which date from a later century. They spoke in voices that were rarely recorded. They acted in ways that were rarely witnessed. But their bones remain, their recipes remain in the margins of books they never intended to write in. Their fears remain, encoded in the demographic data of a world where 1 woman in 3 died before the end of her reproductive life. Their courage remains in the simple fact that they kept trying to survive, to love, to bear children or to avoid bearing them, to live on their own terms as much as the world would allow. In 1348, the world broke. But the women did not break with it. They adapted. They learned. They passed their knowledge on. And that perhaps is the deepest lesson of this dark year, that even in the face of apocalypse, women have always found ways to protect themselves, to protect each other, and to choose, however imperfectly, however dangerously, the shape of their own lives.